A messy midweek picture, snow and freezing rain around the GTA, a trade and tariff fight sharpening between Ottawa and Washington, and fresh talk from both the US and Canada about regime change in Iran, with quiet diplomacy happening at the same time. Later in the brief, the key question: when leaders say regime change, what does it actually change in the risk of escalation? Today in Toronto, expect temperatures around 0 degrees Celsius, with snow in the mix and a chance of slick stretches as precipitation shifts through the day. One practical local note first. Conservation authorities are flagging flood advisories and warnings in parts of southern Ontario as warmer air and rain in the pattern start working on the existing snowpack. The main risk isn't a single giant flood event. It's fast-moving water, rising creek and river levels, and ice jams, especially in low-lying areas. If you're near ravines, bridges, or creek crossings, the message is simple: keep distance and assume the banks are unstable. And on the sports calendar, Blue Jays spring training is now properly underway in Dunedin. One name to keep an eye on is left-handed pitching prospect Ricky Tiedemann, back after a long rehab following Tommy John surgery. The Jays' third Grapefruit League game is set for February 21st. Now, turning to higher stakes. The main thread today is Iran, and the unusual overlap of hardline language, visible military positioning, and reported back-channel talks. In the U.S., President Donald Trump has publicly suggested that regime change in Iran seems like that would be the best thing that could happen, while also claiming tremendous power will soon be in the Middle East. At the same time, the Pentagon has moved more major assets into the region, including sending a second aircraft carrier. Here's the key point. Rhetoric and military posture are moving in one direction, toward pressure, while diplomacy is reportedly moving in another, toward talks. Reuters reporting, citing a source, says U.S. envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were scheduled to meet Iranian representatives in Geneva, with Oman acting as a mediator. And in a detail that underlines how crowded the diplomatic calendar is right now, that same source says the envoys would also meet officials from Russia and Ukraine in Geneva, the same day as part of U.S. efforts tied to the war in Ukraine. On substance, the Trump administration is signaling it wants any nuclear talks to be broader, not just uranium and inspections, but also ballistic missiles, Iran's support for armed groups in the region, and the Iranian government's treatment of its people. Iran, for its part, has indicated it's prepared to discuss curbs on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief, but has ruled out linking nuclear talks to its missile program. The risk here is misread incentives. When one side widens the agenda and the other side says nuclear only, negotiations can stall. And when negotiations stall during a military buildup, even a small incident can feel like a turning point. Now bring Canada into this. Canada's Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, told the Globe and Mail that Ottawa will not re-establish diplomatic relations with Iran until there is regime change in Tehran. Global Affairs Canada has reinforced that posture, saying ties won't be restored while the Iranian government continues to brutalize its people and deny their legitimate aspirations. This comes as Iran faces large protests and a violent crackdown that reporting describes as having killed thousands of protesters since late December, sparking condemnation abroad and demonstrations in places including Toronto. Canada has also announced another round of sanctions on Iranian officials, the 23rd round of Canadian sanctions against Iran since 2022. A quick orientation line. Canada's position here doesn't mean Canada is directing events inside Iran. But the phrase, regime change, matters because it narrows what diplomacy can realistically achieve, and it signals to allies and opponents what outcomes are considered acceptable. And there's a political sensitivity to it. The reporting notes this echoes a prior controversy when a former Canadian minister publicly raised regime change in Russia, drawing a hostile reaction from Moscow. One thread to keep in the background. When governments publicly set regime change as a condition, it can harden the other side's stance, even if there are still quiet channels looking for narrower deals, like limits on parts of a nuclear program in return for sanctions relief. Mid-brief marker, and a quick shift to Canada's economic and trade positioning, which is tightening in parallel. Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada has no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with China, and the government says it will respect its CUSMA obligations, including notifying partners before any trade deal with a non-market country, That's landing amid heated rhetoric from Donald Trump, who has threatened a 100% tariff on Canadian goods if Canada makes a deal with China, and has posted claims that China is taking over Canada, claims Ottawa rejects. Carney has named Janice Charette as Canada's chief trade negotiator to the U.S. for the coming CUSMA review, and Mark Wiseman has been named the next ambassador to Washington, as Canada rebuilds its front line for what could be a difficult negotiating year. Why this matters locally? If tariff threats turn into real measures, the impact doesn't stay abstract. It shows up in manufacturing orders, cross-border supply chains, and jobs in Ontario. And one more policy signal worth noting, because it intersects with trade and industry. Ottawa is now allowing up to 49,000 Chinese-made electric vehicles into Canada each year at a 6.1% tariff instead of the previous 100% tariff. That cap is still a small slice of the overall market, but it's enough to affect pricing at the margins, and it comes alongside a reset in federal EV policy under Carney, including ending the EV sales mandate while bringing back consumer rebates. Experts are split. Some see a pragmatic attempt to keep adoption moving. Others want mixed signals can slow investment in charging and manufacturing. Now, the final piece to watch. Back to Iran and to that question from the top. When leaders say regime change, it raises two timelines at once. The first is immediate: military posture, sanctions, and the risk of escalation through miscalculation. The second is long-term, whether pressure can actually change the behavior of a state or simply push it to dig in. Over the next few days, watch for three concrete tells. First, whether the reported Geneva talks happen, and if they produce even a narrow agreement to keep channels open. Second, whether the U.S. continues adding forces to the region or starts signaling limits and objectives. Third, whether Canada's sanctions and diplomatic posture are joined by additional measures from allies, or whether the coalition stays focused on containment rather than transformation. Keep an eye on the weather pattern and those flood advisories as the snowpack begins to shift. Today is one of those days where conditions can change by the hour. That's your daily news bite for Wednesday, February 18th, 2026.